Good afternoon. Welcome to today's 120 Water webinar, School Lead Sampling Programs, Best Practices from PW Grosser. My name is Isaac Pellerin, and I'm thrilled that you've made time to join us today. A couple of housekeeping items before we dive in. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording tomorrow with everyone who is registered. At the bottom of the Zoom webinar window, you'll see a Q&A module. Please use this to submit questions that you would like to ask our presenters. I'll use this to curate those questions and ask them at the very end. And please use the Q&A module as opposed to the chat module, as it will help us keep the questions more organized. Today's webinar is brought by 120 Water, and our platform transforms how water programs are managed. Our cloud software kits and services transform how government agencies, public water systems, and facilities manage their drinking water programs that protect public health. We're also joined by PW Grosser, who's the leading environmental engineering firm serving the New York metropolitan region. They deliver a wide range of water quality services, including the development and delivery of potable water solutions on behalf of their clients. Today, we're joined by Erica Walker, who's the Director of Environmental Policy and Programs at 120 Water. Walker joined 120 Water in late 2018 from the Indiana Finance Authority, where she managed a statewide drinking water lead sampling program for public schools. She also has worked for the Water Quality Research Program for the city of Bloomington, Indiana, and in the Air Pesticides Toxins Management Division of the US EPA. She holds a master's degree in environmental science and public affairs from Indiana University. So welcome, Erica. We're also joined by Jenny Lund, who as project manager at PW Grosser. Ms. Lund has extensive knowledge and valuable hands-on experience in the environmental and civil engineering fields. Her experience includes a wide range of subjects, including preliminary site planning, water quality investigations, property condition reports, and permit applications. She received her Master's of Science in Civil Engineering from New York University, Tannen School of Engineering, and Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from Worcester Polytech Institute. Ms. Lund is also a licensed professional engineer in the state of New York. So welcome to you, Jenny. A quick commercial here. Erica has launched a podcast called Confluence, which you can find the second episode on our website, which recently launched with the episode with Ken Stark from Metro Nashville Public Schools, and where they dig into the lead sampling program in Nashville. And it would be incredible for you to take the time to listen to that episode and to listen to Ken's story. As we get ready to get started, I'm going to turn this over to Erica, who will get us kicked off, and then we'll have time for Jenny to share her content. And as I said, questions along the way. Use the Q&A module, and we'll ask those at the very end. So take it away, Erica.
Great. Thanks so much, Isaac, for the introduction, and thank you to Jenny from PW Grosser for being willing to share your experiences and your expertise. We think it's really important to say upfront to our school and childcare staff that are joining today, we understand that lead sampling may not have been the very first thing you thought about when you woke up this morning. From what I understand of facilities and operation management life, on a normal day, facility folks are putting out any number of fires, and really no day in 2020 has been a normal day. That said, water quality in school and childcare buildings is an important issue. We know a healthy school environment is part of the whole child ethos. What kids eat, breathe, touch, and drink impacts their ability to learn and thrive. And facility managers are responsible in large part for creating and maintaining a healthy place for kids and for adults inside those buildings. And in my experience, folks in these roles take this responsibility super seriously. One of the challenges that I observe when working with school staff on water quality issues is that they find themselves in unfamiliar and contentious territory. They aren't water quality experts, and talking about lead within the community can be really tricky, which is why Jenny and I hope to provide you all with some breadth and a little depth regarding what we feel are some of the most crucial aspects of doing this kind of work. For my part, I'm going to take what I've learned in working on large-scale testing initiatives in several states and what I see in the policy arena and provide a general overview of the reason to test, what you might find when you do, and then leave you with some recommendations to consider. We have lots of free content on school testing on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at these resources if anything we say here today strikes you as helpful, which of course is our goal in taking some of your time today. And then Jenny's going to get a lot more tactical in her presentation, and she's going to provide you with really a roadmap for how to think about setting up a testing program. She has some great examples of her work, both from school districts and childcare facilities, and then she's going to leave us with some thoughts on remediation and overall best practices. And then as Isaac mentioned, we hope to leave 5 to 10 minutes for questions, and he's going to help us navigate that. Next slide, please, Isaac. Great. So here at 120, our partnerships leader, Lowell Huffman, is helping us execute our mission of protecting public health through transforming how water quality programs are managed. And his approach aligns with our overall philosophy, which is that removing lead in our communities really needs to be a collaborative effort across state agencies, water utilities, schools, childcare facilities, and citizens. And this is why I'm really excited to have Jenny with us. Consulting firms like PW Grosser specifically bring an immense amount of engineering and water quality expertise to the table, and they're using it to help schools find and remove lead in their drinking water systems, among a wide variety of other things, as we heard in her bio. This slide, it represents our view of what lead sampling and mitigation programs look like for us and for our clients. In some cases, we deliver these tools and guidance to school districts directly, and then we empower them to map, sample, remediate, and communicate. In other instances, like the City of Chicago, for example, we partner with engineering firms who use our software and sample kits, and then they pair it with their deep understanding of plumbing design and water chemistry to help facilities locate and remove lead in both an efficient and super effective way. Next slide, please, Isaac. I wanted to take a minute to think with you about the big picture, which is why should we sample our buildings for lead in the first place? The first and most important reason is to locate what we call sources and sinks of lead and to remove or reduce those sources. We'll get into defining what that means a little bit more in the next slide. But as Ken Stark from Nashville succinctly said in the podcast Isaac mentioned, you don't know what you have until you look for it. It's as simple as that. At the heart of it, though, getting lead out of your facilities is about ensuring the health and safety of children and adults who learn and work inside it. Lead is one of the most widely studied human contaminants of all time. It's naturally present in the earth, of course, but when we eat or drink it, it can pose very serious health risks. And when we think about it being present in schools, we need to acknowledge that it's a neurotoxin. We know children, especially those under the age of 6 years old, who have less defined or soft blood-brain barriers are more susceptible to harm. We also have not yet identified a safe level of lead, which is why there's such a wide variety of recommendations from 1 part per billion to 20 part per billion for when schools need to take action. Our third reason to sample is that it provides schools with an opportunity to educate their communities about lead sources, many of which are likely in their own homes and in the very same places that you might find them inside your own facilities. This is one of the many leave behinds of environmental work, and it can really help parents and families understand the complexity of what you're trying to do. And then finally, um, communicating clearly and effectively about getting lead out of your facilities can help further foster trust and a spirit of transparency. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about where you might find lead if you test. As I mentioned earlier, I find it useful to think about sources and sinks of lead inside buildings. Lead can be present inside a wide variety of plumbing products throughout your building because, unfortunately, manufacturers have been able to add it at varying levels over the past several hundred years. In fact, up until 2014, producers could put up to 8% lead in so-called lead-free plumbing products, which means, contrary to popular belief, lead in school and large buildings really is not just a problem for old buildings. It is a problem, though, that schools inherited, which is important in terms of educating the public about the reason for testing. So common physical sources of lead in drinking water systems are lead service lines. That's the straw that connects the water main in the street to the building or home. Brass components like elbows and shutoff valves, old lead solder, and flux. Lead service lines, that straw, were effectively banned in 1988, and it's commonly assumed that these are not found outside of schools since lead is a soft metal and not ideal for delivering large volumes of water. That said, I have seen them at schools, and it's certainly worth a consideration as a source. Sinks for lead, those are all the places inside your facility that can trap leaded sediments and particulates that flake off the various sources that I just mentioned. Those are commonly aerators on faucets, Y valves and laterals, or strainers on water coolers. In fact, the Elflin 2016 image below is a disturbing picture of a water cooler strainer clogged with leaded sediments. So these sources and sinks can be littered throughout your system, and what determines precisely when lead is released and how much is a product of water chemistry, how often fresh water is moving through the system. Sinks for lead can act like tea bags. Imagine an aerator full of particulate lead. The longer lead sits in the stagnant water, the more likely it is to be released in higher concentrations, which means the first person to take a drink from that faucet or cook with water from it might get a high dose of lead. As Jenny is going to discuss, many of these sources are identified when you conduct a plumbing profile or create a sample plan, whatever term you want to use. And that's going to help you make heads and tails of the results that you find. This is where the real value of sampling comes into play in my mind. Next slide, please, Isaac. Thanks. As we have folks joining us from around the country today, I think it's worth stepping back and looking at the rapidly evolving policy response to this issue. There's no national requirement to test all school or childcare drinking water systems for lead, unless, of course, your facility happens to meet EPA's definition of a public water system. So until the feds decide to weigh in, states are taking action on their own. Today, 16 states and Washington, D.C. require school districts to test, while only 11 states have some requirement for childcare facilities. There's a lot of variety in the actual laws, but the policy foot is certainly on the gas, and it doesn't seem like we're slowing down anytime soon. In fact, last year, I think we saw something like 300%, a 300% increase in the number of policies on school or childcare testing moving through various state legislative processes. It's also true, though, that EPA is proposing to have water utilities sample all schools and childcare facilities that they serve every year, or every 5 years, rather. And this would likely not replace the existing state mandates, as the proposed lead and copper rule revisions only require super limited sampling, and that's a lot less strict than many of the state laws that I referenced. It's also worth mentioning here that EPA is releasing $60 million in funding across all 50 states for lead sampling. So if you're interested in doing this work, certainly keep your eyes peeled for announcements about some of that funding. Next slide. Thank you, Isaac. Like many of the topics that we've covered so far, I think remediation could be a webinar all on its own. And in fact, we did host one earlier, I think this year, and you're welcome to view that for free if this topic is on your mind. The main point I wanted to get across today is that remediation or mitigation should happen in phases because it can take a little time to really pinpoint sources and sinks of lead and to select the most efficient and effective way to remove it in your building after those results come in. It's not brain surgery, but it can take some thought, time, and sometimes outside expertise. I think it is useful to frame remediation in terms of the immediate, interim, and permanent steps or phases before you even take the lid off of your first bottle. As Jenny's going to discuss in a bit, there are a variety of options out there, but they all fall into these categories in my view. I think most importantly, when high lead levels are found, you should immediately prevent access to that site by posting a sign, turning it off, and then take some time in the interim to figure out why that concentration was high. And finally, select the best option for that site. Next slide, Isaac. Thank you. Communications should also ideally happen in phases, even though any school that proactively tests for lead should be applauded for being proactive. But when information about their efforts is delayed, withheld, or not clear, it looks as though there's something to hide and people start to panic or get angry. When I look across state policies, there's a lot of variety when it comes to how and what states ask schools and daycares to share with the public. If you're in one of these states, certainly make sure that you're being compliant with the law, but I think it's also really important to develop your own holistic communication strategy. Simply put, I think there are really 3 key times to communicate with the public or with your community. Those are before you test, when results are received, and then after your remediation work is complete. 50-page lab reports are really not going to answer people's questions. They're going to want to know why you're testing, what you found, and then how you're protecting their kids from lead exposure. The good news is these messaging methods are pretty simple. And again, we've covered this topic on various webinars, but also in that podcast interview with our client in Nashville, and he had some really sage advice, I thought, on this topic. Next slide, Isaac. Finally, before I hand things over to Jenny, I just wanted to leave you with a few recommendations related to what we've covered here in the last 15-20 minutes. First, try to collect enough data to make sense of your results. 120 has given a lot of thought to this, and I know Jenny and her team have as well. You're really looking for patterns in your facility. Do you have a bunch of leaded shutoff valves or water coolers? Is there leaded solder on your building laterals? How can the information that you collect help you figure this out quickly? Next, identify your partners. In most schools, the lead reduction squad is a combination of the facilities manager, the superintendent, and maybe a communications director if you have one. Do you have someone on staff with plumbing expertise? Do you need to identify an outside expert? And then finally, to head off any misunderstandings with the community, it's super crucial to have a simple and clear communication plan before you sample. Okay, I hope you found something in this presentation useful. Jenny and I will be taking questions at the end, and I'm happy to speak with any of you afterwards. And with that, I will let Jenny share her insights with us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Isaac and Erica, for the introductions and for kicking this off. As Erica mentioned a little while ago, there are no federal laws or regulations that require that schools or childcare facilities sample for lead in drinking water. Of course, the exception to this, as she mentioned, is that if the facility owns or operates their own public water supply. So in this case, these facilities are then regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. The United States Environmental Protection Agency developed a manual titled The 3 T's for Reducing Lead in Drinking Water in Schools and Child Care Facilities. And this document was last revised in 2018. And this manual is a great reference for those that are just starting to develop a lead sampling program. It provides an overall guideline as to what to do from communications to sampling to remediation. So I'd recommend, if you haven't looked at this yet, that you definitely check it out. What does the 3 T's stand for? So the first T is for training, which is to train school and childcare officials to raise awareness of the 3 T's program, and also to summarize the potential causes of health effects of lead in drinking water. The second T is for testing, which is to test drinking water in schools and childcare facilities to identify potential lead problems, which I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about. And then the third T is for taking action, and this would be to take action to reduce lead in drinking water. Next slide. So where do you begin with sampling? So you first want to develop a lead sampling plan. You're going to want to collect first draw samples from outlets that are used for drinking and cooking. These outlets will be 250 milliliters in volume, and they should be collected first thing in the morning before any water has been used for the day. After you collect that first draw sample, you can also collect a flushed sample, although this is not necessarily required. So what you would do is you would let the water run for about 30 seconds before you collect this second sample. And this sample will only be analyzed in the event that the first draw sample exceeds the action level. So just provide some additional data and helps you isolate where the potential source of lead could be in the event that there is contamination. And all outlets that are used for drinking and cooking must be sampled. So some examples that I put here are bubblers or water fountains, bottle fillers, kitchen faucets and pot fillers, classroom sinks, classroom combination sinks, which is both a faucet and a water fountain in one. And if you refer to that photo in the upper right-hand side there, this is an example of a combination sink. Bathroom sinks and nurse's office sinks. And then some examples of outlets that shouldn't be sampled would include art or science room sink, custodial or utility sink, hose bibs, and the hot water side of faucets. Of course, there's a few exceptions to everything. So for this is, say there's a hose bib that is on an athletic field and it's used to fill up water coolers, or if you have a custodial sink or utility sink that's in a hallway and is accessible by students, you'd want to make sure that you sample both of these because they could potentially be used for drinking water sources. So you can look at the photo there on the bottom right-hand side, and this is an example of a utility sink that's in a hallway, but it's locked in a closet, so you wouldn't necessarily have to sample this since it's not accessible. Next slide. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you develop and utilize a sample ID system that's easy to identify where the sample is being taken from just by looking at the ID. So you can use a combination of letters and numbers, and each ID must be unique so that the analytical laboratory that's analyzing the samples can accurately keep track of the samples and data. And some information that you typically want to include in the ID would be the floor, the room type, room number, outlet type, and sample number. And I'm going to give an example here on the next slide. So this is an example, and as I mentioned, the first thing you want to include is the floor that the sample is being taken from, followed by the room type, the room number, the outlet number and type, and then the sample number. So if you look on the right-hand side there, you'll see that there are 2 tables that provide different types of rooms and outlets and some examples, so you can see what the different options are for coding. This obviously is just a quick summary. There are many different types of rooms and outlets that can be included as well. And then one thing to note too is your sample number, which is the very last number. That's always going to be different because you're going to keep track of the total number of samples collected for the building. So this will essentially be a running total for all the samples collected during the sampling event. So that first example there that I have up top, which is 03 HA 0306.1B-20. So this is a sample that was taken from the 3rd floor in the hallway by room 306. And it was the first bubbler that was sampled, and this is the 20th sample for the building. So then going to that second example there, which is BSGY 0002.1B-5. This is a sample that was taken from the basement in a gymnasium, that's room number 2. And it was the first bubbler that was sampled in the room, and this is the 5th sample for the building. And then that last sample there, following the same pattern, that sample would be taken from the 1st floor classroom in room 120. And it was the first faucet in the room, and this was the 9th sample for the building. And additionally, if you're working with a large school district where there are a lot of different schools and they have different IDs themselves, at the very beginning of the code, you can include the building ID or number. That way you can easily keep track of things and you don't get IDs mixed up between different schools. Next slide there. So once you perform your sampling and you get your sample results, you'll want to compare them to the EPA's action level for lead in drinking water, which is 15 parts per billion or 0.015 parts per million. So as Erica discussed briefly before, if a sample result exceeds the action level, you want to respond immediately to the results. So some immediate responses would be to turn off and tag the outlet so that you can easily identify that it's an outlet that had an exceedance. You'd also want to post not for drinking or cooking pictograms at the outlet. And an example of this can be seen there on the right-hand side of the screen. This is just one example. There are many different ones that you could use that could fit the situation at hand. After you implement your immediate response, you would then want to implement a short-term or interim control measure. So this could be to develop and implement a flushing program to routinely flush outlets. You can also direct building occupants to flush the outlets prior to use. That way any water that's been stagnating will be flushed out of the outlet. You can also install point of use filters, and you can also provide bottled water to building occupants for drinking and cooking purposes. And then after that, as Erica mentioned before, sometimes it takes a little while to come up with what your long-term or permanent control measure would be. And so a couple options would be to replace the outlet with a lead-free certified fixture. You could replace the piping and or if there's a lead service line. Again, you can install point of use filters as your permanent control measure, although this will definitely require routine maintenance, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more at the end of the presentation. And you can also modify the plumbing system to bypass the source of lead contamination, depending on how extensive it is. And then after you implement your control measure, you want to make sure you retest. That way you know if the outlet can safely be put back into service. Next slide. So it's very important that you maintain records of all activities associated with lead sampling programs. I always like to say that if you don't record it, did it even happen? So it's best to assign just one individual to manage the data to ensure that it's consistent. If you have too many people managing the data, things might get unorganized or people might have different ways of doing things. So you want to make sure that everything is consistent. Some different records that you want to make sure you keep would be the sampling date, any field notes. So for example, if you have an outlet that's broken or damaged, if it was inaccessible, or maybe if it was equipped with a filter, these are all important things to note. You also want to include your sampling results, any remediation efforts that were undertaken, and then also any follow-up sample results. And so data can be managed a couple different ways. So you can use spreadsheets similar to Excel, or you can use a web-based platform like 120 Water's platform. Makes it very easy to sort data and quickly reference things, especially when you're dealing with larger districts or if you have a lot of samples that you're managing. Also maintaining these clear records helps with communicating with the public regarding sampling efforts, results, and recommendations, as Erica discussed previously. And it makes it easier to respond to any questions or inquiries that a district may receive from the public. Next slide. There are many different ways to help assist and manage districts, both on the consultant level and also at the district level itself. So at the consultant level, which is something that we could help with, would be to provide guidance to districts, which could include providing information and recommendations regarding sampling and testing procedures, as well as preparing data and documents to use when communicating with the public. Consultants can also develop sampling plans, which will include providing recommendations on outlets to be sampled, which I talked a little bit about earlier. They can also help with coordinating sampling activities, which would include performing initial site visits and walkthroughs, and then the sampling itself. And consultants can also help perform a review of the sampling result and provide recommendation for remediation, which I also talked about a little bit earlier. And then at the district level, districts can use their own staff for performing sampling. However, using individuals that are adequately trained will help avoid any sampling errors. So some errors could include not collecting the first draw sample properly or mishandling bottleware. This is especially important because inside the bottles there's an acid preservative, so you want to be really careful with that. It's also imperative that districts ensure that their custodial or facility staff are available if a site walkthrough or site visit is performed, and also during the sampling event itself. Custodial and facility staff have so much detailed knowledge about buildings that a consultant would never know, so it's really important that they're there to provide assistance. Outlets can sometimes be tucked in closets or in parts of the building that aren't necessarily easily accessible, which a custodial or facility staff would definitely know. And it's also critical that they're there during the sampling event to assist with opening doors to rooms that may be locked, and also gaining access to the entire facility. And then lastly, one contact at the district level should be provided to help facilitate activities, and this will help cut down on any miscommunications. And then at each building or facility where sampling activities are performed, you want to make sure that there's a name and cell phone number of an on-site contact. We've had instances where we've arrived at schools at 4 or 5 in the morning and no one was there to let us into the building. So we weren't able to perform sampling that day, and having an on-site contact will definitely help cut down on any confusion and sometimes some very early morning phone calls, which not everybody wants. Next slide. So there are different types of school districts that we deal with. So I have them broken down into 3 main categories. First one is large school districts, which are often associated with cities or densely populated areas, or even maybe large regions. You have small school districts, which are typically schools from maybe a town or a small region, and generally has maybe an elementary school, middle school, and then a high school. And then you have private schools, which can either be a standalone school or it could be a network of a couple schools. And schools will vary widely in size. Some of them could have hundreds of outlets, while others might only have 20 or 30 outlets. This is one reason why it's really important to conduct a site visit and building walkthrough before the sampling event, so that you can inventory the outlets, and so that you also know the bottleware that you're going to need while sampling to make sure you have everything on hand. You can also then prepare the sample IDs ahead of time so that you don't have to do it on the day of, when you might not have a lot of time at the school. There are also many instances too where you're going to need multiple teams of field staff on site while sampling to ensure that the sampling is completed within the allotted time you're given. Samples will typically be collected on a weekday, usually early in the morning before the school is occupied for the day, because you want to make sure you get that first draw sample before any water has been used. So that's why it's important to get there early in the morning before anyone else is there. And then we've also noticed that data management can be extensive depending on the type of district that you're working with. Large school districts could be best managed with a web-based platform, so you can streamline the process and keep track of the data in an easily accessible way. This is especially important when it comes to remediation, so you can track what outlets need to be remediated and when that occurs and what was done, and then any follow-up samples. And whereas for smaller school districts, or say a private school, you can usually manage these schools by using spreadsheets, because it's just less data that you have to keep track of. Next slide. There are also childcare facilities which should be sampled as well, particularly since childcare facilities, just the ages of the students is very important. So sometimes sampling these facilities can be included within the scope of larger districts. This will also help ensure that sampling is performed at these facilities, as an owner of a childcare facility may not know what to do or where to start in terms of hiring a consultant to perform the sampling. These are typically smaller facilities and they tend to have a minimal number of outlets. So there might only be a few rooms like a kitchen, a classroom, maybe a few bathrooms. Outlets we would typically see would be a kitchen sink, bathroom sinks, hand washing sinks, and then either a bubbler or water fountain. In this instance, a site visit or a building walkthrough in advance of sampling might not be required if there's only a minimal number of outlets, but this is something that should definitely be checked ahead of time. And if a site visit isn't performed, I definitely recommend putting together a quick sketch of the floor plan so you can denote the sample locations. So something that you'd want to include would be the room numbers, location of outlets in the room, and any notable features. And for this, you can often use a simpler coding system than the one I discussed previously, which you would just denote the sample number on the floor plan that you developed. And you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a really simple sketch of a floor plan from a facility that we sampled from. And it was actually just a couple of rooms. So it was easy enough just to sketch it up while we were in the field and denote where the sample was taken from and the sample number. So that way it was easily referenced later. So you can see sample number 5 was taken from the staff lounge and there was just one sample in that room. So it makes it a little bit more streamlined. Next slide. So now I'm going to go over some sampling best practices. So I have a couple of do's and don'ts here. Some things that you do want to do is you want to visit the facility prior to the sampling event, especially if it's like a large school, and you want to develop a plan for the day of the sampling event, along with your IDs to keep the samples organized. You want to make sure you maintain normal water usage throughout the day on the day before the sampling event. So this is important as to why you would sample on a weekday. So usually Tuesdays through Fridays and maybe even Saturday mornings, depending on the school. That way you're sampling the water after a day where it's been a normal usage throughout the day. You also want to confirm that the water had remained stagnant for at least 8 hours prior to the sampling event, but no more than 18. And again, this ensures that the water was used in like a normal or routine fashion. And you want to make sure you keep clear notes, logs, and chain of custodies during the sampling event. And then some things that you don't want to do is you don't want to flush the water before the sampling event. So this could mean either before taking your first draw sample or even the day before. You don't want to sample from the hot water side of an outlet, as hot water is not typically used as drinking water. You also don't want to assume you're going to remember the location of an outlet, especially if you're in a big school. Sometimes you might think that you're going to remember something or not note something down, but it's important to keep good, clear records while you're performing the sampling. You also don't want to sample every single outlet in a facility unless you discussed this previously with a client. And you also don't want to forget to maintain records of the sampling event, remediation efforts, and any communication. Next slide. And this is just some general water management best practices. This is definitely particularly important, obviously, as a lot of schools and facilities have been closed recently. So some of these items might be good to implement before schools are open for the year. So this could be including flushing drinking or cooking outlets after weekends, breaks, closures, and holidays. So you'd want to make sure you flushed bubblers or water fountains and kitchen outlets. But you'd also want to flush outlets at the end of risers or at the end of laterals. This would make sure that you have clean, fresh water that's being distributed throughout the entire building. You just want to be careful that you don't open too many outlets at a time. But this is something if you want to develop a flushing plan or program that you could speak with a consultant about. You also want to make sure that you flush outlets that are prone to stagnation. So it could be, as I mentioned earlier, an outlet that's in like a closet, or if it's maybe in a room that's not used as a classroom anymore. That way, again, you just keep the water moving and keep good turnover in the system. You also want to make sure you clean faucet aerators, screens, and inline strainers. So you can see the photo there on the right-hand side. Erica kind of touched on this a little bit before, but you can see that before photo, which is of a faucet aerator that obviously has a lot of sediment that has built up on it. And so we just removed it, and we used a little brush with some clean water, and we scrubbed it off, and you can see the after photo there. It looks brand new. So it takes a little bit of time, but it's something that could definitely help, as lead can build up in these aerators, which could become a problem over time. You want to make sure you only use cold water for drinking and cooking purposes. You want to maintain any point of use filters on a routine basis. This could be changing them every 6 months or per the manufacturer's recommendation. So you want to make sure if you have any filters that you're following what they recommend. And you also want to educate your building staff and building occupants. And next slide. And that's it for me. So we'll just start taking some questions.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Erica, to you both. There's just a wealth of knowledge in managing a program that protects public health. We have a couple of questions that I'd like to start. Again, if anyone has any other questions, you can ask those in the Q&A module, and we'll ask those to our presenters. First question is, when retesting the same outlet, how do you code the second round of testing? And I'd like to start with you on that one, Jenny, first.
Sure, definitely a great question. So you can do it a number of different ways. You can actually leave the code the same if you want, because you're going to have a different sample date. So the data should be tracked differently in that sense. Or if you only have that one sample that you're taking from that room, instead of doing like a dot one, you could do a dot two, or you can even add another letter or number into the coding. That way you know that any sample that has that additional letter or number would be your retest sample. So that could quickly denote it, and that could be used very consistently throughout all of your samples.
Great. Erica, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, Jenny described one method really well just there. I think, you know, for us as a software company, we have kind of developed our own method of tracking what I would call inventories or assets of plumbing devices. So let's imagine that you are sampling at ABC Elementary. Every single source of drinking water or cooking water in that facility has usually a number attached with it. Let's say the kitchen faucet is 101. Our solution for remediation testing is we allow you to assign samples to that same fixture over time. So one sample you might attach might be that initial round. So you would tag it as initial. Later you might come back and want to do a remediation sample. So you attach a remediation sample to it, so that when you dive back into Jenny's point, you can really easily see what your sample results were across sampling initiatives over time without having to rummage through a bunch of information.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Our next question is just looking for advice on managing field and team sample collectors. You know, you touched on, you know, those could be custodial staff, and a little bit on the training. Do you have any other insight there? And Jenny, sorry.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, so the main thing, so on our level, I work for an engineering and environmental consulting company. So all of our staff is educated, and we have standard operating procedures. We do routine trainings in-house to make sure that people know how to properly collect samples, keep logs and records. So that's what we just do, again, as on our company level. I believe Erica with 120 Water, you guys can also provide some instructions if you have a facility that's performing their own sampling.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
So that's on another level where you can, training can be provided if that's something that you would want to do, which is something that 120 Water can help with.
Do you have anything to add to that, Erica?
Jenny made the point really well, and thanks for thanks for telling them about our training. That's
You're
great.
welcome.
I think again there are lots of ways to do this work, and it, as Jenny talked about well in her presentation, depending on how complicated your infrastructure is and how big your facility is, you may want some sort of boots on the ground, some support, and that technical assistance layer. So, training takes different forms, and our two companies, Jenny described how hers works. We have lots of internal training too. We're software people, but we're also water scientists and data scientists and have worked for utilities. So, that's the internal part. And then external, we work with a number of districts and states that they feel strongly that the facilities in certain cases can do this work themselves. And so in those cases, we'll do, usually they're like online webinars and or sometimes in person, where we walk through, here's how you can think about doing this work on your own.
Great. We have a really timely and pertinent question that just says, that this person says that part of their reentry plan for the upcoming school year, again in light of COVID, is to keep all communal drinking sources out of use. What's the best way to do this without creating stagnant water? We're not going to turn off the fixtures. And Erica, let's start with you there.
Right. Yeah, this is something that we've been talking a lot about with our clients, and I've been trying to process it with researchers and others who are trying to figure out what the best solution to reentry or maintaining water quality in the face of this this pandemic and period of disuse. In that case, if you're not barring access, but you're instructing folks not to use the fixture, I mean, one thing I would say is how are you for sure that they won't be using it if you haven't barred access? So that's just one thing to keep in mind. I think the other thing is, Jenny talked about this in her last slide, which is great, just general water quality advice. If the goal is to keep folks from gathering around water coolers, for example, to slow the spread of COVID, I assume that's what that question had to do with. Then you might also think about having a flushing program alongside that. So maybe when folks aren't in the building after hours or early in the morning, you still flush the water daily or weekly to keep things moving. What do you think, Jenny? Is there anything you'd add to that?
No, that's pretty much exactly what I would say. This kind of comes back to where I said you can flush the end of a risers or the end of laterals. So this at least just turns over water throughout the entire building. Of course, it's great to flush every outlet if you can, but as I mentioned, some schools have hundreds of outlets, so that can be extremely tedious and time consuming, and it would be like an additional task that gets assigned to someone in the facility who probably doesn't even have a lot of time to begin with. So that's one recommendation, would be to flush pretty much the ends of the line. So any risers that are going to higher floors and any laterals that extend out on each floor. And that will just keep water turning over throughout the building, which will help bring in clean, fresh water, hopefully that has some chlorine residual in it to help minimize any bacteria growth. So that would be the main recommendation. And again, just outlets that you know that are typically used for cooking or drinking, if those can be flushed as well, that will just help keep things improved for the future when those eventually do get put back on for the building occupants to use.
Yeah, and actually, Jenny, you just brought up something really important. I mean, this isn't a conversation that's necessarily about this topic explicitly, but we're not just worried about lead contamination with sort of post-COVID stagnation impacts. Jenny just mentioned bacterial growth. So, things like Legionnaire's disease or Legionella, so that the depletion of that chlorine residual, in the face of that, you can have all kinds of nasty things growing inside of your plumbing. And, in the case of Legionnaire's disease, it becomes airborne. And then we're not as worried necessarily about younger children there. That could be your staff. In fact, I just saw a case in the news where some school staff and an older school staff member came down with Legionnaire's disease because of his work in the facility. So flushing can potentially help with some of those things. I think, as Jenny mentioned, you have to be really thoughtful though about your flushing program. It's not just about opening the water up and letting it out until it's cold. You have to remove and displace the entire volume of water in your facility to do it.
Yeah. And there's a follow-up, same person just says recommendations on frequency of flushing. Would that be a weekly, a daily, or a monthly? Yeah. Do you have thoughts there?
Monthly, you definitely would want to do monthly. You'd want to do weekly. Daily would become, I think, too cumbersome. Also, obviously, keep in mind that water is still going to be used for like hand washing, I'm assuming, and also in like bathrooms. There might even be a little bit of use, obviously, in like kitchens. So there still will be water turnover in the building. It just might not be as much as it previously was. So I would say weekly is probably definitely a good place to start. But again, it would probably help to have someone that knows a little bit more about your facility, or that brings someone on board to look at exactly the conditions you're dealing with that can provide a more specific plan for your facility.
Yeah, and I would point folks on the 120 Water website. There's a webinar we did recently with another partner, Michael, or with NOAA Systems that has an auto flusher device at specific fixtures to help with auto flushing to keep water moving as well. Yeah, I think the last question is just any thoughts on average cost of remediation. Like let's say there is a hit, or remediation action has to happen that's beyond simply taking the device offline. What type of cost is associated with that typically? Or do you have any insight into that, Jenny?
Yeah, so of course it's going to vary. You say it's not a remediation effort that's not as simple as maybe just changing out the faucet, which maybe if you have a plumber for your facility, they could do fairly easily. When you get into having to change out the lines that are behind walls, you're obviously going to start to incur a lot of other costs. You're not only talking about the piping and the plumbing modifications, but you're also talking about having to fix drywall. You're talking about having to paint. So it's really hard to put a number on what it could be because so many situations are different. So I'm hesitant to say anything in particular. It could obviously be in thousands of dollars range, depending on what you're doing, how much work has to be done, how intrusive it is, where the piping is going. Some piping can be as simple as you just have to remove ceiling tiles and you're able to access piping if it's maybe on a higher floor. But maybe if it's in a basement and you have a slab on grade, and you need to get at piping that's in the flooring, you're gonna have to start breaking apart concrete. So it's gonna just vary dramatically. Of course, the best thing to do if you get to the point where you need remediation is, if you're working either with yourself or you're working with a consultant, to definitely get shop around with pricing and try to get a couple of different quotes so you can make sure that you're getting the best pricing available. Don't necessarily just go with who you might always use. Try to get a couple different quotes just so you make sure that you are getting the best value.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And Erica, you might have some insight here as well, just in terms of potential cost of remediation solutions.
Yeah, and can you hear me still clearly? I had some audio issues,
Absolutely.
Isaac.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, actually, when I was with the Indiana Finance Authority, we looked at this issue for a group of, I think, 40 different schools, and that report's available for free. But in that, we collected labor and material costs for remediation, and we used 15 parts per billion at that time as kind of the trigger of, do we have a problem? Should we do something about it? But and in that case, we found that on average, schools spend about $550 on remediation. And, that reflects kind of a variety of options. Jenny mentioned this earlier, but sometimes the solution is really just as simple as taking the thing offline. Do you need 10 sinks in your art classroom that no one is using? So can you just put up a sign? Can you just turn it off? So sometimes there are some really low cost options. And then sometimes it was really just as simple as, the facility replacing a faucet. I think, as Jenny was alluding to earlier, though, there are some instances where you may have lots of those sources littered throughout your building, and you need to bring in a plumbing expert, a consulting expert to figure out how to replace all those things, or figure out how to get some treatment in there. So, I would say, don't panic. There can be some low cost, effective, efficient solutions, but also know that, experts are around and can help you navigate some of these complicated decisions.
Great. Thank you so much. We are coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to make sure that we get people back to their days before we hit the hour. Jenny and Erica, thank you again so much for just for the depth of knowledge that you've provided here based on your expertise. And thank you to everyone who made the time to join. We'll send out the recording by end of day tomorrow to everyone who registered, and we'll keep you apprised of other educational opportunities in the future. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.